Hello, everybody. This is Mike Van Meter, and welcome to the Recovery is Possible podcast. I want to thank you for joining me. You can reach us at our Facebook site, which is also called Recovery is Possible, or our website, which is vanmeterwellnesssolutions.com. This podcast exists to educate the public about addiction, remove the stigma associated with addiction, and offer help and support to those suffering from addiction. So this episode is sponsored by FHE Health, a substance abuse and mental health treatment center specializing in treatment for first responders' needs, including PTSD, anxiety, and substance use. So take the first steps to a better life today by visiting fhehealth.com. So folks, today I want to introduce you to a good friend of mine, Don Thiry, and he is a student along with me in the Hazelden Betty Ford Foundation graduate program, and I'm working on another degree in addictions and co-occurring disorders, and we met through this program, and he's a lot of fun, really good guy, and wanted to bring him on the program to talk about his thoughts on recovery and specifically the topic of misperceptions that get in the way of pursuing recovery. And this is such an appropriate topic because in my internship in the treatment center that I'm working at, you see a lot of patients that will come up with their own preconceived notions of what recovery is and probably more importantly, what it's not. And we have to spend a lot of time sort of getting them in the framework of the models that do work, and we're going to talk about some of those things today. But Don and I had been talking about this subject, and I thought it was something that would benefit all of us in a discussion today. So with that, I want to introduce you to Don. So Don, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mike. Glad to be here.
Well, go ahead and tell us a bit about yourself and, how you got to, how did you get to Hazelden Betty Ford? What brought you there, and what do you plan to do? And your thoughts on the misperceptions regarding recovery.
Well, it's funny because when you ask what brought me to Hazelden Betty Ford, I think about the first time I went to Hazelden Betty Ford, which was as a client, not as a student. And that was 17 years ago. It was my third rehab experience, the first time that I did inpatient. And it was the culmination of 8 years of attempting to put together some sobriety. And it was the first one that worked and stuck. So it's been over 17 years since the last time.
Congrats. That's a big deal.
Well, thank you, sir. It is a big deal. And, so I experienced kind of the travails of the challenges of getting sober, even if you're a person who has some resources, even if you're a person who acknowledges the issue and wants to get sober. And I did not have, significant mental health challenges on top of my alcoholism. So I was lucky in a lot of ways, and I still had a hard time climbing out of the hole. And since emerging from Hazelden back in 2004, for whatever reason, it wasn't a really well thought out decision, but I was very open about the fact that I was sober and new in sobriety and had been to rehab, and to the point where I told first dates, I told people during job interviews, and it was just kind of liberating. And I figured if it didn't work out well, that I could, relocate or just change my mind and stop being so open about it. But the fact is, even then, I figured maybe 1 out of every 4 people or so would have a negative reaction. And honestly, in 17 years, I can't think of a single person that's had a noticeably negative reaction to my telling them that. And by and large, almost always the reaction is the person who I tell about this, about being sober, tells me about somebody else they know who either got sober or didn't get sober or needs to get sober or whatnot. So being very open about it led to a lot of opportunities for me to try, at least, to help other people get the help that I got and learn the things that I learned. And it really opened up my eyes to the challenges other people face that were, modifications and different from mine. And the challenges that the people around the affected people face. So, when I got to where I was helping parents and siblings and spouses and so forth, trying to get their loved ones in to get help, is a real eye opener. And a lot of that is what led me to leaving the elevator industry after a couple decades and diving into this full time, because it was just so rewarding, both educational. It helps me stay sober, but also rewarding when you see the success stories and how how happy and healthy and hopeful people can emerge on the other side to do cool stuff like Mike Van Meter starting podcasts.
Well, I don't know that I should be an example to anybody, but no, I agree with you. No, I appreciate it. And you're absolutely right. It's funny because I was so leery about telling people that were not already in recovery circles about my story. And I had the same experience that you did, in that people very, very much to my surprise came out with their own stories of, let me tell you about my brother, let me tell you about my wife, let me tell you about my uncle, let me tell you about so-and-so. And I really just wish that they had gotten sober. And a lot of times, sometimes people will then say, hey, look, I think I have a problem myself. And like you, Don, I've not had anybody that I'm aware of have a negative reaction towards me talking about sobriety. In fact, quite the opposite.
Yeah. The net is pretty clear. And I really thought that maybe some people who had, the rough childhood, what I always thought of as, daddy used to drink, daddy used to hit mommy, I hate all alcoholics. I'm like, okay, I'm going to run into people that have that. And I haven't seen it yet. Even the people who had that rough childhood and those horrible experiences, they love that anybody that's out there kind of fighting to help those kids and to help those parents get out of it. So it's been heartening, and I look forward to. I feel like the people struggling with mental health are a little behind the people struggling with substance use disorders in terms of that sort of understanding and social acceptance. And I think it's trending in the right direction. But I suspect that progress in that'll be measured in decades, like it was with alcohol and drugs. So it'll be good that it's making up ground, but it needs to make up a lot more, because I think a lot of people still kind of stay in quiet shame with the other depression, anxiety, bipolar, et cetera, that can really debilitate people.
Yeah, I completely agree. Now, you had mentioned misconceptions about recovery, and I think that's a phenomenal subject because I run into that quite a bit too. In fact, it's almost a given when I work with somebody either as a sponsor in a 12-step program or they come to treatment, that they have a completely skewed view of what recovery is. So talk to us a little bit about that. What about misconceptions? What do you run into?
Yeah, so I think that there are some common topics that are either sincere obstacles for people pursuing recovery, and specifically AA, which is kind of the most well-known and accessible resource for people trying to get sober. And there's also insincere obstacles, and that sounds judgmental. So I'll admit to you kind of how I fell into that category myself. It's kind of a human nature game, but people who don't want to get sober, don't want to go to AA, will say it's a cult, will say it's a religious cult. And I don't know what the technical definition of a cult is, but it's no more culty than any other kind of club or church or anything, and that people go and it helps them and they support each other. And some people end up embracing it with a level of fervor and with a specificity of how they like it, that it can turn other people off. The AA, I feel at some point where I'm getting a little blasphemous because, I love AA and it's played a big part in what saved my life. But the U.S. Constitution has been amended a couple dozen times, and there are things in AA from a marketing perspective that I think scare some people off. And so the concept of the higher power, and you get to decide what your higher power is, and it's a topic of AA meetings all the time. I've been to thousands of AA meetings. I've been to more than 100 different AA meetings. You will hear thousands of different takes on what sort of flexibility people have for what their higher power can be if you are agnostic or if you are atheist. But the fact of the matter is, for the people who have really malignant relationships with religion, based, most people that I know, it's based on kind of their childhood and negative experiences with it when they were children. They're still going to hear the word God a lot. And the founders of AA and the Big Book says God a lot, and they were very religious. And it's not uncommon for AA meetings to close with the Lord's Prayer. And so I'm agnostic. And so, I'm proof that you can go to AA meetings for 17 years and stay sober, and that hearing a bunch of other people who may be, Christian and that may be a significant portion of their sobriety and their AA experience. But you need to be able to let them accept the part of the program that's working for them and let the other parts of it slide off your back. So, one of the only sign I think that I've ever seen that's kind of a common sign at AA meetings that drives me nuts is a sign that it says, don't work my program, don't work your program, work the program. And the fact of the matter is, in this insufficiently humble alcoholic's opinion, there isn't the program. There's work the steps and go to meetings and all that good stuff. But nowhere in the Big Book does it tell me how many meetings I should go to per week. Nowhere in the Big Book does it tell me whether or not I should be okay with my wife having alcohol in the house, or if I should take painkillers after a surgery, or if I should have desserts that had alcohol cooked into it, but the alcohol burnt, blah, blah, blah. There's a million different little decisions that we make for how careful we do or don't want to be. And every alcoholic kind of decides how careful they want to be. And so it's tailor-made. And my program involves letting people who are religious incorporate that into their program, and for me to not get worked up about it or offended by it or to let it get in the way of my program. But a lot of other people do. And I'm rambling, but just to put a point on something that I thought I said earlier that I would circle back to. The intentional excuses that we make to help us justify or rationalize not getting sober or not engaging fully with AA. I did a half semester of drunken night law school back in my drinking days, and that sort of legal mindset is something that I used against myself during those 8 years when I was trying to get sober, because in the preamble that's read before pretty much every AA meeting, one of the things that they say is all that's necessary to be a member of AA is a desire to quit drinking. And every time I heard that, what I thought to myself was, I don't belong here because I don't want to quit drinking. I want the bad stuff to stop happening. I was a social drinker. I was having a pretty darn good time. It was the hangovers. It was the missing work. It was the debt. The physical illness and the shame involved in not progressing in my career, et cetera. That was the stuff that bugged me. And that was a loophole that I used to relapse and to, not go to AA at times and to leave meetings. And so there are these little kind of opportunities that we give people who are struggling, in school, we'll call it the pre-contemplative stage, Mike, but where, people still in denial, where I was for a good long time, who are looking for an excuse to stay there. And AA, from a marketing perspective, still hands them some. And so when I'm talking at meetings and I hear, newcomers that are hearing things that are likely, perhaps more likely to turn them off than to turn them on, or even in, my internship now with school, I really try to beat the drum on the flexibility that AA allows. And if you don't like a meeting, don't go to it anymore and go to a different one. And if you don't like your sponsor, fire your sponsor and get a different one or get another one, because you can have 5 sponsors if you want. And we can, I've fired 2 higher powers, and there's no religion that'll let you do that, but I'm on my 3rd higher power in my 17 years. And I think that's pretty cool. And I think from a marketing perspective, that's a much easier sell than this is the way I got sober. This is the only way that I will ever kind of endorse any newcomer getting sober who might be thinking about attending some meetings.
Yeah, very well said. And I completely agree with you. It does seem to have, when you first go in, it seems to have a cultish aspect, but I agree with you that it can be a turnoff for a lot of people, but it's because, again, they don't understand, or B, aren't ready to get there. And I often tell people too that as people, we actually don't have a problem worshiping something. And bear with me for a second as I explain this. What I say to people is that in reality, you were worshiping something. You were worshiping the bottle. Right now, we're talking about alcohol. So in this case, alcohol. It could be drugs. It could be pornography. It could be gambling. It could be anything. Because if you think about it, alcohol. If we're talking an AA meeting here, you were worshiping the bottle. You really were. It was your God. It told you when to get up, when to go to bed, when to go to work, where to work, if you were going to work, what airplane you were going to take, if you were going to take an airplane, where you traveled to, who you traveled with. If you think about it, it dominated every aspect of your life. And so what happens is a lot of times people come into recovery and that becomes replaced with something else, which is now meetings and sponsors and AA. And it sort of takes on that aspect with some people, not all people, but for some people. But the nice thing is that they're not drinking. I've not met anybody that's lost a job because they go to too many AA meetings or they're too enthusiastic about their sobriety. I've not met that person yet. But it does take all different types of shapes and forms in people. And you're right, Don, that nobody really tells you what that should look like. And there are some people that you will, because people are people. There are people that say, this is exactly the way that you do it, and this is my program, and you will do it exactly the way that I tell you, or else that's not really recovery. But I think it's important to understand enough about the 12-step programs and AA in particular, and understand what is appropriate and what isn't appropriate. Because when I meet those people now, I just, okay, well, that's his program and it works for him, but that's not what works for me. The challenge is getting people to not get turned off so much that they just stop participating and stop trying. What do you think about that?
I agree that the word worshiping, when you started, I found interesting.
Yeah.
Just because my higher power now, I used to, when I was in meetings, give a really long kind of description for what my current higher power was, in a way to try to help newcomers that were struggling with what, since it's an early step that you have to kind of adopt a higher power, and it's hard to get past that I would always make a point of kind of trying to explain the flexibility that existed. And then as I was explaining it to a client in my internship, I realized that I could shorten up my whole explanation and just say that really my higher power right now is my recovery plan. I believe that my recovery plan of attending meetings and learning about different wisdom traditions and engaging in getting this degree and doing philanthropic work to try to help people in recovery, these things are my recovery plan. And I trust that my plan will work. And so that's where my faith is. So I was trying to wrap my head around worshiping my recovery plan versus just kind of trusting it and dialing it up, as needed. I had a kind of a very minor relapse 9 years ago, a couple glasses of wine in Paris, and it was, didn't get drunk. There was no drama. It was, not long lasting or anything. And just decided that I had to tweak up my recovery plan. And so I did. So more meetings and more commitments and no more boozy desserts and, no more occasional NA beers. And so there's just kind of faith in what I've learned, both through AA and through a bunch of other things. And putting it into practice. So I don't know that I worship my plan, but I trust it a lot, and I talk to people about it a lot, and I modify it a lot to try to stand as far away from the fire as I can. So it might be, I think we might be saying kind of the same thing, but coming at it from different angles.
Yeah, and what I meant by worship is really alcohol. I think more in the sense of when I was drinking, drinking became, I mean, it was my central thought from the time I got up to the time I went to bed, and kind of dictated my behavior in between. And to me, that borders on worship. Now, when you get into recovery, it's not so much that. I guess what I'm getting at is that there are people that it comes across that way. They just get so involved in their recovery program that it gives that appearance. But like you had mentioned, though, there's something about recovery that is individual. To me, this is just Mike's observation over time. There are certain principles in recovery that are universal principles, but how we execute those principles are very individualistic, and it looks different in different people, if that makes sense. For some people, sure, they have to be all in and almost like, a religious fanatic where that's all they talk about. They're always quoting things. They're always, their practices are constant. There are people that need to do that. And then there are other people that, you would, unless they told you outright, you wouldn't even know that they were in recovery because they've adopted those principles. And it looks different in their life. They don't need to talk about it all the time. They don't need to go to meetings every single day. They don't need to read the literature, so many times a day. But again, you do have, I know people that get up the first thing in the morning is they do their meditation, they do their devotional, they read something out of the Big Book or the 12 and 12 or some other, whatever other program they're in. And then they go to meeting at noon, and then they go to the meeting in the evening, and they're on the phone with their sponsor. And that's great. If that's what's keeping them sober, that's fantastic. And I'm not one to criticize that because that formula works for that person. That's not necessarily the formula that I have to adopt, and maybe you don't have to adopt, but I'm not going to criticize what another person does in their recovery. But I do think that sometimes there are people that will tell a newcomer, this is what you must do to get sober. And that's incorrect. Right. Would you agree with that? Does not mean that you have to do exactly what I do to stay sober. It may look now. There are certain principles that I think that one must understand about recovery and about the disease model of addiction. But how that manifests itself may look different in you than in me.
Yeah, well, you touched on one big thing, and you also reminded me of kind of a fun story. But a big thing that I explain to people a lot, both people who are trying to get sober and people who are trying to understand, other people who are trying or who need to get sober, is that alcohol use disorder, substance use disorder, it's not like COVID, where you get a test and you're positive or negative, you have it or you don't. It's, even talking to friends and family who ask me about it, I say it's on a score of 0 to 100, and I don't know what my score is, but, I know people who had scores higher than mine based on stories I've heard at meetings and in treatment centers. And I know people who have very, very low scores. I mean, I tease my wife all the time as being a great example to me of what I was not as a drinker, because she will often, pour a glass of wine and walk away and forget to ever drink it. Which, yeah, exactly.
I never had that problem.
Exactly. So she's near the 0 end of the spectrum, and I was a little different than that. I was at the guy who would walk out in the parking lot from the dive beer, throw up, and then walk back in the bar and drink for several more hours. So that's closer to the 100 end of the spectrum. But certainly have heard worse stories than mine.
And if a couple at the table next to her, he got up and walked away, and they left half empty beers or wine, you would drink it.
you stare at them. Yeah. And so different people, even just based on that, even if you left out every other, thing that colors somebody's decisions for what their program is going to look like the religion thing we talked about, somebody who is more, I was not a person who grabbed a bottle of vodka and chugged vodka straight, by the pint. That wasn't me. Some people were, right? And so how strong, how stringent, how desperate a program of recovery needs to be, I think changes by the person. And then the other question that I ask people is, are you looking to craft a recovery program for yourself that does just barely enough to keep you sober, but you don't want to do any more than what you need to. So, God forbid you go to one more meeting per week than you think you absolutely need. Or, talk to more newcomers or work the steps more stringently because, you have all these other priorities. And so therefore you are going to stand, just right on the ledge of the cliff. If I'm at the Grand Canyon and I'm near a cliff, I'm not going to stand within 10 feet of a ledge. I'm just not going to. And if I'm standing 10 feet away, Mike, and you come up behind me and you shake me by the shoulders, I'm going to kill you. I'm going to turn around and I'm going to be very, very upset with you because I'm somewhat afraid of heights, right? I don't want to stand right on the ledge. I certainly don't want to jog on the ledge or sit on the ledge, but some people do. And so as you get more desperate to stay sober, you are willing to do more and more to be as safe as you can possibly be. I want the airbag and the seatbelt and to drive at a reasonable speed, et cetera, et cetera. And different people are standing on different height cliffs. Some people get sober at 16, 17 before they ever drink just because they saw what their parents were like. That's amazing because they don't even know how they would have drank if they started. So that's, it's just, there's a lot of choice involved in how badly we need to get sober, how badly we want to get sober, and what we're willing to do to stay sober. The story I was going to tell you that I think is kind of funny. Again, I mentioned I'm a bit of an AA meeting tourist, and I've been to over 100 different meetings. And one that I tell people about a lot is up in Vancouver, Washington. And I was walking to this meeting, and it was back in a parking lot a little bit off the main road. And a kind of a rough-looking young man, walked out and met me about 50 feet away from the entrance, and he was kind of bald and neck tattoos and the whole thing. And he said, "Are you here for the meeting?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And it's not common to be kind of greeted in this way outside of a meeting. And he said, "Have you ever been here before?" And I said, "No, I have not." And he said, "Well, here's the deal. Don't speak unless you're called upon. You raise your hand waiting to be called upon. And since you've never been here before, you will not be called upon. So
welcome
sit
to the meeting.
and sit and do not speak." He said, don't extend your legs because we don't want people to trip when they walk past you, and don't look at our women." And I was hooked, right? I mean, I've been to 90 something meetings probably before this. I'm like, this is going to be the most amazing thing I've ever seen. I go in, and it turns out I did get called upon. But this was a little house that had been bought by an ex-con, and he was running AA meetings for ex-cons who didn't want to go back to prison. And so these were serious, desperate, death grip, very, no kidding around. This is how we're going to do it. They ran a very stringent program, a very specific program that was for this group of people that was just desperate to not go back into prison. And I get it, right? I mean, it wasn't my experience. It wasn't a meeting I'd ever go back to. I went to a different local meeting the next day. And as soon as I started this story, they were all like, "Oh, we know where you went." And they were all laughing. But, these people had been through some stuff. And in terms of the experience of their alcohol or drug use and or their prison experience, these people wanted to stand very far away from the ledge, I guess, to circle back to my previous metaphor. And they were going to countenance no nonsense for anybody who was only halfway invested in the project. And the meeting is probably the worst thing ever for a non-ex-convict newcomer to go to for their first AA experience. And I guess as it scared away a lot of people that would never go to AA again. But for the very specific crowd that they were targeting, probably a godsend. Probably just a wonderful, wonderful resource of people who knew their experience and were going to be completely invested in helping them get their lives together.
Yeah, that's Well, let's talk about that on the other side here a little bit. Let me do a little plug for our sponsor because you just raised some very, very interesting points. So let me just go through this here real quick. This episode is sponsored by FHE Health, and FHE Health has been providing life-changing behavioral health services for more than 20 years. They treat substance abuse and mental health disorders in an individualized and comprehensive approach. Recognizing the specialized treatment needs of the first responder community, they've created Shatterproof, a dedicated program for law enforcement, fire rescue, and similar communities to receive treatment among peers. They're experienced in providing privacy and working with unions for employment, and FHE Health is committed to providing the best care experience for patients, for their families, and for our community. So learn more at fhehealth.com. So you raise a really interesting point, Don, and that is you talk about people that absolutely need to get sober, right?
Yep.
The present population, and how those people were just almost boot campish serious about their recovery. And I've experienced similar type of things, and you are correct. It can be such a turnoff. If that happened to be the first meeting that you walked into, that would be really kind of a showstopper for a lot of people. And that's why it's important to emphasize to people that are coming in, go to a lot of different meetings, because there are a lot of different types of meetings out there. In fact, at the treatment center that I'm working at right now, interning at, I try to do a lot of teaching to the patients about the different types of meetings that are out there. And a lot of people don't understand that there's open meetings, closed meetings, specialized meetings, professional meetings, men's meetings, women's meetings, LGBTQ meetings, and on and on and on, all kinds of different groups. And the formats, whether it's big book, 12-step, speakers meetings. And a lot of people don't realize the very variety of meetings that are out there, and that you should go to meetings and experience a lot of these different setups, and then find out, what works for you. But it is important for people to understand. But what I was going to share with you, Don, is when I first came into the rooms of recovery, people like that were a big turnoff for me. The old school AA person that is like, shut up. Don't talk. If I want to learn how to get drunk, I'll talk to you. You want to learn how to get sober, you'll listen to me. Take the cotton out of your ears and put it in your mouth.
Yep.
Those kind. And I didn't like.
If you have less than 10 years of sobriety, do not speak at this meeting.
That's right. You run into that kind of stuff. I didn't like it in the beginning. I have to confess to you, Don, that over the years, I'm starting to appreciate some of the stuff that I've seen over the years. I'm starting to kind of appreciate those guys.
Oh, really no.
Am. But
don't let it happen, Mike.
No. Here's what I'm getting at is that over time you kind of change and you see. Well, no, I guess what I'm getting at is I see how different people work and what works for different people. And I understand that there's people that works for, but I understand that there's people that doesn't work for. But I've been around long enough, and I would like to think that my sobriety is strong enough to where my personal recovery is not affected by somebody like that. You know what I mean? It's not. It doesn't bother me now to see people that are that way, but I do understand why that's damaging to the newcomer coming in. So, what do you think of that?
No, absolutely. I think, and I think it's passion that comes from a good place. I mean, a lot of people, most people, have stories similar to mine, which is, they didn't. The same day that they decided that they probably needed to quit drinking, they went to their first AA meeting, and it sunk in right away, and they never drank again, or they never used drugs again. The next time I hear that story will probably be the first. I've heard the story of the people that never drank because of their experience with their parents. I don't think I've ever heard the story of the person who the first time it occurred to them they should stop, that they did, with the help of a meeting. I've heard of some people who just kind of decided on their own that they shouldn't drink anymore. And honestly, I suspect those people were towards the lower end of that spectrum of alcoholism that I was talking about before. I couldn't prove it because there's no real test to go with it, but most people have to go to treatment multiple times. Most people go in and out of AA meetings for a long time. And so this is why it's become a little bit of my mission. I called you to volunteer to talk to you on your podcast, partly because, I'm a egotistical guy who likes the sound of his own voice. And so when I go to AA meetings, I try to not talk. I think it's important for me to try to be a better person, to try to be a better listener, and to actually pay attention to what other people say. And so I usually will only speak in a meeting if there's kind of one of those little uncomfortable silent periods that happens in AA meetings sometimes, or if it seems to me that a newcomer is getting an excessively rigid variety of or representation of AA pounded towards them, and that I fear that some newcomer is going to be turned off based on some rigid interpretation of what AA must be. And that's the only time that I'll really kind of make a point of diving in and either sharing during the meeting or pulling somebody aside after the meeting to say, hey, there are a lot of people that agree with whatever that guy or those people were saying. There's also a lot of other people who do it this way. And, so keep looking. Don't give up on the whole concept based on that little subset. And I think it's important. But people find what worked for them, and it saved their life, and they want to share it. And so I get the passion, and I get why they think that that's the magic recipe. Because if you veer too far from the AA magic recipe, then that there certainly could be an argument to be made that if somebody were to take my point to an extreme end, that you're not really talking about a recovery program anymore. And so you touched on it before. There are key principles, there are key concepts as to what AA is about that are really important to embrace. And so, like so many things in life, it's just trying to find the happy medium of getting everything that works and throwing out everything that doesn't, and trying to maximize the number of people that can be brought into the fold of AA or smart recovery or treatment in general, or any of these different recovery concepts and practices that help people deal with these problems that are affecting so many millions of people.
Yeah. Well, we obviously, you and I are people that practice the AA principles, but you and I do work in the treatment field in our internship. What about the person that comes to you and says, I want nothing to do with AA? Don't talk to me about that. I want to learn about something else. How do you approach that? And, for the listeners out there, what sort of advice do you have for that?
It's tough because I have experience with a client like that who was, very atheist and very anti-AA. And so I just tried to get straight to the principles of, changing coping skills, of being self-aware of the way that we process life and life's challenges, and developing self-regulation skills to deal with challenges better than we did before. And my opinion or my impression is that there's a massive amount of overlap between AA, Christianity, Stoicism, Buddhism, some of the psychotherapies that we're studying at Hazelden. There's a lot of focus on mindfulness and on cognitive behavior, and just as opposed to people go to anger management course, and instead of getting angry and reacting and breaking something, or getting angry and hitting somebody, to instead get angry, notice that you're angry, have some anger management skills that you've learned, whether it's a breathing or counting or taking a walk or exercising or whatever it is, to manage your emotions. So you still get to feel them, but just noticing them and managing them in a more productive way. I dealt a lot with self-pity when I was drinking a lot, and I thought that drinking was romantic. So if I went to the bar and felt bad for myself and watched the booze bounce around in the ice cubes, or did shots and kind of punished myself with Jägermeister, I saw some romance in that at the time. And so kind of learning the aspect of that's nonsense, and learning accountability for my own life, learning my part in problems that I had with other people, and acknowledging that there's just a lot of overlap, and you don't need to learn it from the Christian Bible. You don't need to learn it from the AA Big Book. So, like with the guy I was talking about before, who was the atheist who's reluctant to, resistant to AA, I gave him a book of Stoic readings. So you're reading ancient Roman philosophers, and, more current Stoic practitioners, and you're learning a bunch of the same stuff. And for he loved the fact that Bill Belichick, coach of the Patriots, was one of these guys who follows Stoic wisdom and was into it, and so he's getting quotes because he'd rather read them from Bill Belichick instead of Marcus Aurelius, and that's great. So it's whatever works, and letting people know that there's a lot of that out there, that there's a ton of overlap between the different practices that people learn to cope with different types of problems.
Yeah, and what I like is, and I don't know how you approach this question with patients, is first and foremost is the questions that you're asking. I mean the questions from a patient or somebody, if you're in a sponsorship type situation, is differentiating between an actual question because you're curious about this or you have a different approach, and maybe you're just someone that really is not ready to get sober in the first place, and kind of sorting that out. Do you agree with that?
Yeah.
There's a natural curiosity, and then there's just you're trying to find reasons to not get sober. There's
exactly
right.
So when you say that, you make me think of before, when I'm talking about the excuses. You're looking for your loophole. You're looking for your rationalization as to why that treatment wouldn't help. And the guy I was referencing, that the irony there is that I'm working at a facility that is a religious facility that openly is a 12-step practitioner program, and so this individual checked into a place that's a religious facility that treats people with 12-step program, and this person is kind of surprised that the curriculum isn't lining up with with what they wanted or expected. But again, it's a plan that's designed to fail, and that's part of the nefariousness of the disease. We become our own enemy in that the part of our brain that wants to be happy and healthy is fighting against the part of our brain that isn't ready for that isn't capable of it, hasn't grown in that way, and that we've trained to medicate feelings, etc., with the unhealthy substances.
Yeah, very well said. And I've run into that as well, because the treatment facility I'm at has that. There are some basic religious overtones that are there, and there are people that come in and they seem surprised when we start talking about spiritual matters. Like, why are you talking about spiritual matters? And people just, I don't know if they just picked, how they picked that particular facility to go to, but it's one of those things. But if you're listening to this program right now and you're somebody that's struggling, I think that first and foremost, as Don pointed out, is, do you really want to get sober? If that's what you want to do, then no problem at all asking, questions, because we have a lot of questions. I had a lot of questions when I came in to recovery, but what is your purpose for asking those questions? Are you trying to find that loophole, as Don points out, that you're trying to find that one reason why you shouldn't get sober, or you're trying to prove that you're that one person that doesn't really need this program? Ask that of yourself, and then have that honest conversation, because that's going to be very important. We often say that recovery is not for people that need it; it's for people that want it, and there's a difference. You have to get to the point to where you want to get well. And I've often said, Don, and we'll kind of close out on this and your thoughts on this, that I've often thought that if you ended up in detox, or if you've ended up in a 28-day, 90-day, 180-day program, anything like that, you need to be in recovery. You don't end up in a treatment facility it was, wait a minute, this was an administrative mistake. You got the wrong guy. This is not for me. I think that by the time you end up there, maybe you should have been there for quite some time, and you can try to convince yourself otherwise, but you probably need to be in recovery if you've ended up in that position. So, I always tell people, and I try not to be overly harsh with this, but I think you settled the debate there. The fact that you're here, yeah, you should maybe not drink anymore or drug anymore. It's probably not working out for you too well,
The odds are certainly low. I've met several people who've gone specifically just to pacify certain people in their life who were requiring it, and the denial was still strong in them, and they were just going to do their 28 days or whatever to check the box to quote unquote make so and so happy. But both the people I'm thinking of when I discuss this had seizures and had been taken to hospitals. So certainly would not be any sort of exception to your proposed rule. I try to stay away from always and never and everybody and so forth. So that there might be the occasional loved one who jumps the gun and tries to send somebody someplace maybe before it was needed, but super duper rare. And quite frankly, everything I know of that we learn because of the nature of this disease, so somebody with diabetes needs to learn how to have a different diet.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody with substance use disorder needs to learn how to have above average coping skills, not average coping skills. We start with below average coping skills, but we need to learn how to have better than average coping skills in order to resist our drug or drugs of choice. Having good coping skills is a valuable thing for everybody. I suspect a diabetic diet is probably a pretty good thing for everybody too, in terms of avoiding sugar and losing weight and so forth. But so even if you're not an alcoholic or you're not a drug addict and you find yourself in treatment, there's some good stuff to learn there, because we're learning coping skills. We're learning about what these diseases are, but we're also learning mental exercises and strategies that make us stronger to help us deal with whatever life's going to throw at us tomorrow, because we need to be good at it. Or my knee-jerk reaction, if I start having a whole bunch of bad luck today and tomorrow and everything seems a shambles, my body is going to tell me that I should just punish myself with alcohol to cope with it. And I've learned a lot over the last 17 years to teach me how to cope with it differently, and to the point where my body really my brain doesn't go there very quickly anymore. Extremely rarely, but that takes a long time. And so people new in sobriety need to develop those muscles.
Yeah. And there's the physiological aspect and the neurological aspect to it as well, where I think your brain just sort of reshapes itself, not only just mentally, but actual physically. I think our bodies and our brains just kind of like remold and reshape, because I'm like you at this point, knock on wood. When I have a bad day, my first thought is not to go have a drink anymore. Now, it took a long time to get there. And I'm not going to say that there aren't those days where that doesn't sound like a good idea, but it's fleeting. I think it's less often and less intense, much more fleeting now than it used to be.
Sure.
But it took a long time.
Yep. Yeah, me too. I, probably once or twice a year, I'll wake up in the morning and think, it'll be like a Tuesday or something, and I'll think today would be a good day to go to a dive bar and put $20 in the jukebox and, listen to loud music all morning. And so on those days, I call my buddies from Hazelden when I went there, and other AA buddies, and I still play loud music. I just, wait for that little impulse to pass, and I go to work anyway. And, within a couple hours, I've forgotten that I ever felt that way. And it doesn't happen, like you say, it doesn't happen very often. That's an excuse to listen to loud music. So
that's right. It's kind of interesting that you do it, because I do the same thing. One thing I've noticed is people in recovery, I meet a lot of people that are very much into music and art in recovery. A lot of people. So that seems to be a kind of a common theme as well. I don't know that for those of you that are thinking about working on a PhD thesis, maybe that's a thesis project for you. Why is that? I don't know.
I am
just in case you were looking for a PhD thesis. What's that?
Well, we'll leave that to somebody else. I'm definitely not thinking about a PhD thesis.
No, I think I'll be done for a while. That's cool. Oh man, but Don, hey, any parting thoughts? Just to take us out on this podcast. I've really enjoyed talking with you today.
Yeah, I think I'll there was a topic that I thought we might start with that we didn't even get to, and so I'll just leave the whole concept of anonymity until the next time you're bored enough to want to talk to me.
You know what? I think that we will, because that is a very, very good topic. And let's do that. Let's do, if you'll come back onto the show, I'd love to have you back on the show and let's talk about that.
My pleasure.
Absolutely. Well, Don, thank you so much for joining us today. And again, this episode has been sponsored by FHE Health. According to SAMHSA, first responders are 30% more likely to develop behavioral health conditions like PTSD. So FHE Health specializes in getting first responders better and cleared for duty. So find out more at fhehealth.com. And so, as always, I'd like to say, I don't represent any group, and neither does Don, but we do talk about different groups. Obviously, we talked about some groups today, but we don't represent them. Nobody represents these groups. We're just giving you our thoughts and our opinions about these groups, and hopefully that will help you, because that's what we do in recovery. We help ourselves along the way while we're trying to impart knowledge that we've gained to help others as well. But if we've said something that doesn't apply to you or you don't agree with, then just discard it. But try to take any information that you can use for yourself and use that to help yourself and others as well. And with that, please visit our Facebook page, which is Recovery is Possible, and our website, VanMeterWellnessSolutions.com, and let me know how I'm doing, and let me know if there's a topic that you're interested in hearing about, because I know you're going to want to hear about Don's opinion on anonymity, because that's a subject that comes up quite a bit. But I'd love to hear from you, so take care, guys, and we'll see you next time.